Okay, Wellington's victory, and yeah, many of you know we're going to cover this. It's a big one. A little of the story, why I have it. So, I got Nate versus Wellington, which is based on this system. The first, as one of my very first war games. And struggled with it for many, many years. I managed to play Monmouth, which was also based on this system with some differences and a lot of simplification. Both are simplified, but and you know, had a fair amount of enjoyment out of it. It was never like my great favorite in terms of, you know, enjoying the play and whatever, but it was a workable system. I could approach it. I could understand it. I feel like after a couple of plays of Monmouth, I was able to eventually go back to Ney versus Wellington and think that I could kind of understand it, but didn't feel like it was an enjoyable situation. I think some of the aspects with the extended lines and everything got in my way. But now I replayed it on video, and maybe the simple act of the discipline of being on video or whatever, I actually had a better time than I remember ever having with it. I did have to quit early because the victory conditions to that game were problematic, in my opinion. I have somebody who disputes it, but yeah. But yeah. I started seeing that Wellington's victory was sometimes claimed to be one of the best Napoleonic representations out there. And my memory from Ney versus Wellington, and Monmouth for that matter, but Monmouth is a different conflict and with different constraints on it. My experience with Ney versus Wellington didn't have me convinced of that at all. However, I felt like, look, that's derivative. And maybe if I play the big boy, I'll have, I'll have better understanding. So I did actually pick this up, and it was a hard game to get. The first time, first of all, I would have liked the flat box version probably, but that goes for a fortune. And this is actually essentially the same. The only difference is glossy counters. But the map, I think, is the same. And the rule book, although it has, I assume, obviously it's got TSR on it. It has a different cover. It feels like the rules are pretty much the original SPI, and indeed somewhere in it, yes, see, they're still putting the old SPI office information there and all kind of stuff like that. And they're also talking about you should have 2 game boxes. You know, they did not modify the rules even to cover the fact that this is a different a different edition published really under a different company. Yeah, TSR still, actually, I don't even know if they indicated SPI on this. I don't see it on the rule book, and I do not see it there. I see SPI, Wellington's victory and products of your imagination are trademarks of TSR. It may say SPI. Yeah, it does up there. They're still keeping the label. But I think they had pretty much closed up the SPI offices. I can't see keeping them open. That would just be an extra cost, more or less, unless they needed them. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm pretty sure they closed them up. Never heard anybody talking about going to the TSR SPI offices in New York. So anyway, I wanted to give, first of all, I didn't have a game on Waterloo other than I had the original, not the original, I had the freebie Napoleon at Waterloo thing. But I didn't have a game on Waterloo yet. Now I have quite a few. Not a huge number, but a few. And I didn't have, I heard such good things about the system that I thought, you know what, I'll give it another try. Anyway, the first box I bought was indeed the TSR version. All it came with was the number counters. Nothing else. May have come with some of these charts, because I have way too many of them. I have 5 copies of the charts. Which don't even show up in the inventory. I don't know if they were added because the charts are on the map, but not necessarily in the most useful places. They're both on the French side of the board. So, yeah, not so sure about that. And I ended up, getting the money back for that first order, which came with a box and some some number counters, basically. And by the time I had made that decision, I ordered it again when I saw it cheap again. And again, the TSR version is much cheaper to get, and luckily it doesn't have stupid colors on it the way that the TSR Terrible Swift Sword edition does. These are playable and acceptable. They may have changed the color a little bit, but I doubt it. I don't know. Now, since I went through the Ney versus Wellington rules in detail, I felt like, well, I probably won't have to go through these in too much detail. There's a problem. The Ney versus Wellington rules are a condensation. First of all, there are significant additions, or there's significant things that were paired, to be more precise, in the Ney versus Wellington rules from Wellington's victory. But in addition, they cut it from like a 20 pages of actual rules in here down to 12 pages, including scenario information, in Ney versus Wellington. And in doing so, they removed some relatively important pieces towards understanding the rules. In terms of like examples, in terms of some other things. And also there may have been some intentional changes as well. There were also intentional changes. So in one case, the line of sight rules in Ney versus Wellington, which honestly I found myself not having to deal with in that game because the distances just aren't that great. That I could just do it looks that way. There are some weirdnesses to the line of sight rules though, meant mainly to deal with Wellington's decision to deploy on the reverse side of the slopes, which is not a bad idea. Anyway, the designer did not want to go with like little ridge lines to indicate, you know, where he could deploy that way. So he created a general rule for it. That rule actually works. The one that doesn't work as well has to do with line of sight going down gentle slopes. And the problem is that the game has sort of a, you know, it uses a layer cake representation. I guess any map showing elevations, you could kind of argue it has that. But it uses a layer cake representation, and reality isn't a layer cake. So something that reaches a certain height, a hill that reaches a certain height, it's at that height beyond the crest as well. if it's a range of heights. And yeah, you could really, really carefully construct enough layers, and you have that in kind of the topographical type maps that show a lot of different elevation changes, etc., so that you could really kind of represent that crest at the hill. But no matter what you use, you're going to hit positions where maybe you wouldn't be able to see, or you'd have to come up with something more complicated. Anyway, the mechanisms that are used for the line of sight ended up getting translated into a formula in Ney versus Wellington, and that formula it contains the same problems as the line of sight does in this, which we shall see. It's just a less verbose way of explaining it. This does it in kind of this procedural type mechanism instead of a formula. I don't know which is better in terms of a way of describing things. I am missing a counter, which I had to put. I'm missing one of the French leaders, which luckily there is this was inside the rules, there's a manifest of all the starting units. I might be missing something else. If I am, well, it would either be an unimportant marker or it's within the Prussian army. I have not had a chance to check to see if the Prussian army is all there. Everything else I've gotten. Also, in terms of setup, there is a particular commander on the Allied side. Let me find him here. He's not there. Kempf, I think. Something like that. He's not in the game, but he's not supposed to be. He's not on the setup sheet. So I don't know what that was. I had to make an assumption, and I picked a Dutch commander who I think perhaps is in that position. Let's take a look at some of the components and whatnot. Like I said, you've got, and it's an incredibly complicated design as far as I'm concerned for handling the shock combat and the firepower table. One that requires, it's mainly very, very cumbersome when you're trying to figure out. The shock combat's not as bad, although that's where the designer actually gripes the most. The fire combat, which he's very, very proud of, I find to be cumbersome to use because you have to make multiple lookups on it. Here it's kind of nice. There's a lot of information, all the modifiers and everything on there. That's very helpful. Compare this to the modifiers that were present on the map in Ney versus Wellington, which uses only a single map. Now, one of the things with this game is there's a lot of map that I don't think is going to get used. I don't know where the Prussians come in. I get the feeling it's over here. I don't see an entry hex marked. I was just looking over these rules very recently. Let's see where they come in. Map B? Yeah. Which is going to be over there from the east. So there's some potential for maybe this part of the map to be needed, but it gave lots of room. If they're going to do 4 full map sheets, it gave lots of room for them to put, tables and tracks and all kind of information on it. I think they could have gotten away with a smaller footprint, but it might have involved, it might not have been an easy thing to set up and design. This big a map gives me some opportunity for outflanking type maneuvers, which I'm kind of tempted to, but we'll see what the victory conditions are like. Because I know that the so the main victory conditions involve demoralizing the enemy force, but morale is affected by the Quai, the Hougoumont, the La Haye Saint, I don't know what else, but it's affected by some key terrain locations. Strangely enough, I don't think it's affected by things like Mont Saint-Jean or La Belle Alliance. But that's okay. What else do I want to talk about before I dig into the rules? Yeah, again, I don't know how I'm going to go about the rules. I'm going to try and give overviews of them because you may be approaching this without looking at the Ney versus Wellington stuff. But to some extent, I need to reflect back on that. One of the weirder things here is that we have these one of the weird things is we have impassable hex sides. So built around some of these buildings, I assume these are meant to be really serious walls that could not, be scaled or anything. I was actually just watching something. They did some archaeology on this. Now, here's the thing. Most of the battlefield's been destroyed. They gathered up huge amounts of dirt and built the Wellington's monument on it and stuff like that. But yeah, it's kind of interesting to see this kind of sunken road here. I thought that was a relatively modern discovery. The archaeologists who had found it, were being shown this was probably found, I don't know, it was found within this century, let's put it that way. And this game was obviously made well before that. But there must have been mention of it because there's basically a sneaky path to get, I'm kind of surprised to see that it's in here. I didn't think it was known the way they were talking about it in the video. They made it as if it was this big deal that allowed Wellington to get his ammo in there safely. I think they were overselling the case as to, it may have been known that it was there if it's showing up on this map. And yeah, we got some woods and stuff here, as we should, that are going to be a factor. But yeah, the idea that there are hexes that are impassable on the board is kind of weird, to represent those kind of walls and stuff. It's a weird graphical description. And then we got the two different kinds of cover hex side. And protected hexes is where the cover is giving an advantage. Some places it looks like it's giving an advantage in both directions. Some it's just giving an advantage in one. Yeah, it's Sunday in the morning. I don't know why I'm feeling kind of not really capable, but I know I need to get to this. I actually have an interview coming up this week. Not for work. Let me swap batteries and we'll dig into the rules. Like I said, there are some significant differences. Let's take a look at a unit just to describe it. Formation designation is going to be of importance in this one. It didn't mean anything in Ney versus Wellington. You got combat strength, effectiveness, movement allowance. Different sides of the counter may have different values. So you'll see the line here has a lower effectiveness value, obviously. It also is going to have a lower movement point allowance. But sometimes the effectiveness is going to be reduced by being in line. That has two effects. It'll impact morale checks. It also will affect shock combat. Having a higher effectiveness is important. Artillery have different ratings depending on which side they're on. If they're on their limbered side, they have a crew effectiveness rating, which is, again, the morale and whatnot. This game is going to actually have crew markers so that the artillery crew can leave the battery and wander around, maybe not voluntarily, and they can then be established to operate different guns. The class, okay, so you have the combat strength of the crew on there, and which is really only useful for shock combat, and a movement allowance. And then on the unlimbered side, of course, you have no movement allowance, but you have a number there anyway. But you have the number of guns proportionally, and a class of battery, which is going to be how it fires in terms of over on the relative firepower table. For leaders, and we're again going to have some differences here, you have a command radius and a movement allowance. On the backside is the wounded, disrupted leadership unit. The command radius was used in Ney versus Wellington just to distinguish where you could give bonuses, how far away you could give certain bonuses. Here, it's going to be required for actually commanding the units. You have an artillery fire marker and an infantry fire marker, front and back. These are taking the place, and I may go with what I used before. I used a couple of these. They're a little easier to see and to mark my place along the line, because the sequence of play is going to be the same as Ney versus Wellington, this strangely asymmetrical one. The asymmetrical sequence of play is designed for Wellington's victory. It kind of doesn't make sense in most other battles. And in particular, any battle in which there's going to be, well, there's two things that create the asymmetrical sequence of play. One is the Allies are on the defensive here. Two is that Wellington had a powerful view of the whole battlefield, whereas Napoleon didn't. and that Wellington was given more reactive capabilities. And the asymmetrical nature here allows for that, because before the French get a chance to shock, and before the fire happens, the Allies get to move their units. The French do not have that kind of position. They get to move their units before the Allies get to shock. But there's no fire after French movement, which means that the Allies get a chance to reposition every time the French try to launch attacks. Position themselves for shock attacks, okay, that's fine, but also for firepower attacks. You also have a lot more important terrain in this, I think, just in terms of key hardened locations that are going to be a big deal. Wow, this is going to take forever if I keep at this at this level of energy. Definition of terms. We got scale here, which is the same 100 yards of terrain on the battlefield. Infantry. You know what they don't do? They don't tell you the strength points, the number of strength points in a representation of men. I think that was kind of a mistake that they did that they tell you how many strength points each, or how many men each strength point represents in Ney versus Wellington. Because I think it's a little abstracted in this system, and should be. There are other things that are as well. But the main point is, whenever units take losses, their morale goes down. And that those losses are less strength point losses than cohesion hits. They're that unit's formation beginning to be disrupted further and further. Yes, you can't recover from it, but okay. Well. Except through the magic of skirmishers. All right. Let's go through what happens in the sequence of play, since I started talking about it and it's here now. Okay, the French get to make certain command decisions in this game. This is new, regarding commitment of their units. Basically, they can declare that a formation is committed to the battle. The leader shows up on the battle. We mark over here, and at the beginning there are no French units committed, that the French have committed another formation to the battle. They're going to pay an army morale cost for each formation that they have committed at any given time. The Allies actually start off with 7 formations committed to the battle, which is kind of weird. Some of them are not that far up towards the front. I don't know whether they're intended to advance or not. They shouldn't be. Okay. Like there's stuff back on that ridge there that's committed. And yeah, I had to make a choice on, you know, which leader is going to be committed as to, hey, who's kind of close to the action? And he's as close as many of the others who are committed. So he got the win there. At this point, the French also declare their cavalry charges. And you declare those, you have to make a morale check if this is the same, and then you declare them with these little markers indicating a cone of effect that your charge is going to be performed in. Then the French get to rally. All of their units that are disordered are routed, and enemy fire zones impact this. Then we get to the Allied movement phase. Well, first they have a facing formation phase where they make all their facing and formation changes. Then they get to march. There's an optional rule, which I'm definitely going to play with. I played with it in Ney versus Wellington, where you combine the two and you can make the decisions within. You can make the decisions by unit as to facing, formation change, and then movement. What does this do? I think the main effect it does is it reduces the amount of sort of prefiguring where everything's going to go. I found the actual mechanism to be probably unwieldy, and especially so in such a large battle. After the Allied units move, the French are allowed to shock adjacent units, and if they have any cav charges declared, they can, well, they sort of must do something in order to affect it. Okay. Then we get to a reciprocal artillery fire phase, and you go down the line and pick out, starting on one flank, one of your artillery pieces that's unlimbered, whatever, and you expend ammunition and do some fire with it. And then your opponent picks one of his artillery pieces somewhere in the line, at one end of the line that he wants to fire. Everything earlier than that won't get to fire, and gets to fire that piece. And you alternate back and forth firing artillery at one another. I have a real problem with this alternating firepower. I feel like it creates some gamey situations. Especially with the infantry, because that's what you do next. You do the same thing with infantry fire running down the line. Now, there wasn't a lot of artillery in Ney versus Wellington. There's a lot more here, and maybe not proportionally, but there's a lot more on the board total, and it may have also more impact than it did in Ney versus Wellington. And then you repeat the actions reversing the sides. So the Allies get a command phase, a rally phase, the French get to move, the Allies get to shock, but there's no reciprocal fire phase in between after that. You go to the end of the game turn. By the way, I'm set up for the historical Waterloo scenario, which starts on game turn 11, goes out here to game turn 50. Here's where the Prussians are due in. You can start it significantly earlier There are rules for the softer ground and whatnot in place there. The designer argues that if you want to see a French victory, that's what you have to do. Napoleon made a huge mistake starting the battle so late. And I think most people I think that's pretty much the agreed consensus. But I wanted to see the actual attack or something that is closer to the actual attack rather than a what if that I don't know what it could involve. I'm probably still going to do some things very, very differently and perhaps very wrongly. You have some limitations on movement. You can't move through friendly unit in certain cases. I think it's got to do with the stacking rules. The stacking rules have to be enforced during movement. So basically you can't move different types of units through one another for the most part. Whenever you leave an enemy, whenever you do pretty much anything in an enemy minimum fire zone, you take an opportunity fire type result on yourself. That's one thing that breaks the reciprocal fire paradigm, is that, like, if you're trying to do something like leave an enemy fire zone, minimum range fire zone, or change formation in one or whatever, the enemy gets a shot at you in the state that you were in before you do that. Now, minimum range fire zones for infantry is 1 hex. For artillery, it's like 2 hexes. So you got to be kind of close to the enemy for that shit to happen. There's grand tactical movement. You're allowed to double your movement allowance if you move along a road 9 hexes away from any enemy unit. I thought there was another restriction there. You have to be in command control and not routing, stuff like that. Facing in this game is to the vertices. For most units, there are some units that are considered to have all around facing, like squares and skirmishers and stuff like that. During facing formation, you get to freely reface your unit or make a formation change. You can't do both. But during movement, you can spend a movement point to reface your unit in any direction. Everything has to be faced in the same direction. You can only fire through your frontal hex sides for the most part. If you're fired on through a flank or rear, you will be... No, sorry, just the flank. You will be considered a Class 1 enfilade target. Thought rear was bad for you too. Apparently not. You can be fired on when you attempt to change facing in a minimum range fire zone. Yeah. Facing affects shock combat. You can only shock through your frontal hex side. You may have penalties for being shocked. If you're subjected to a shock through either flank or rear, you end up disordered by that, which has a penalty, but now you have all around facing, so it's no big deal. So it doesn't end up in a modifier, it ends up with the disorder. The disorder has a penalty on your shock value, basically 2 points. The number of different formations in the game. You can only change formation for the most part voluntarily during the facing formation phase, which we're incorporating into the movement, remember. Infantry have 4 different types: column, line, square, and skirmish. Cavalry have only 1 formation in this game. They don't differentiate between line and column. Artillery have 2, which is limbered and unlimbered. Artillery are special. They get a free facing change when they do a formation change. And they're allowed to unlimber during their march phase. This will cost them a movement point, but allows them a lot of flexibility to charge up towards the enemy. Yeah, so during your movement, basically during facing formation, which is integrated in movement the way I do it, you flip the unit over and limber it, you move it forward, and then you unlimber it, and you're in position for fire. That feels very, very liberal to me, but whatever. Artillery have an artillery crew marker deployed with them, which will have the same effectiveness rating as the gun. Now this is kind of weird. I have a couple extra artillery crew, high quality for the English, and I can't find them. Oh, in terms of coloration, I also want to complain about, what the hell is it? The Hanoverian units. They have their own commanders, and sometimes have the same designations as the regular English units. They're the same color as far as I can tell. There's a slight maybe difference between them, but basically these red counters comprise the English and the Hanoverians. And there are some cases where I'm finding it very, very difficult. Well, there are some cases where they're treated differently, I think. At the very least, they have their own formations, and that is disturbing to me when those formations have the same numbers on them. Okay. Where are we? So the artillery crew is what takes the morale hits for artillery. And they can be either disordered or routed. And while disordered, a battery cannot change formation and fires using the disordered formation line on the fire combat table, which is not good. That's this top level here. It's going to have you firing on the worst column of the chart. When you fire at artillery, depending on how you're firing at it, most fire is going to hit artillery at class 3, which is fairly safe. It's about the same as skirmishers. But you're firing at the crew, and any hit will destroy the crew, and now the gun is unmanned. And you can bring another crew in for it, or you could even bring a skirmisher unit up and take command of the crew, of the guns that way. Not a best option, but crews that are attached to horse artillery batteries have a movement allowance that allows them to move with that horse artillery battery. There's no special markers for it. The crew just runs along with them. Disorder and rout are involuntary formations. Skirmishers are always going to be considered disordered formation. I'm just looking for things here. Infantry in column, the front side of the counter with the higher movement point, higher, potentially higher effectiveness rating. Line formation, again, it's going to be a lower rating. It's going to have a lower movement, and it's going to have potentially a lower effectiveness rating. When an infantry unit forms line, it may be boned into extended line formation. If it's British, King's German Legion, or Class 1 or 2 Hanoverian Battalion with a current strength of 4 or more, it is forced into an extended line. Now, there's an option that changes this a little bit, but it's still not great for the unit. If the infantry unit's not listed there and its strength is 6 or more, it will be in an extended line. And those are marked with these markers coming out the flank. And they're going to greatly hinder the capability of that unit to move. It can move straight forward, but it can't wheel, it can't change facing. It'll become disordered and collapse into one hex. Still in line, but not the extended line. And this caused me a lot of mechanical problems in Ney versus Wellington, because I would just go around plucking off my disordered markers from units in the back and forget the line extension that they would create for that. It's just, I don't know. I'm going to have to learn how to cope with that a little better. The extended line is also, well, if it falls under its strength point requirements to be at an extended line, it stops being when it collapses again into its own hex. It can be fired on at either of its hexes. It can be attacked in shock combat in either hex, but if it's attacked through a flank hex side, it collapses, because remember, it's disordered, or rear. When it shocks, it will automatically be disordered and collapse. I'm trying to look for how it fires. It pays the more expensive of the terrain that it's moving through. I'm trying to find the fire combat. It's always treated as a single unit which possesses full troop strength and effectiveness in each of the 2 hexes. When it's fired upon its target classes, the terrain involved. I am not seeing its fire combat. I think it may be different here. In Ney versus Wellington, you could fire full strength at minimum fire zone, but you could only fire, well, you could fire at minimum fire zone, but you could only fire at maximum fire zone if both parts of the unit could see you. And I feel like this one requires both hexes to be seen all the time. But I'm not finding... here we go. An extended line formation may only fire as line formation if the target can be observed by both the hexes occupied by the extended line formation. I think that's a change. Maybe I'm wrong. I certainly tried to conform with this anyway. Let me go see. Yeah, strangely, it's not included in the section that I just saw here. And here, under firing, it is present in Ney versus Wellington that you can fire at anything in the minimum. Let's take a look here. 11.42. Does this tell me? Extended line may only fire at a line if the target unit can be observed from both, observed from this, if it cannot be observed from both the horizontal line. I'm not sure why they changed that. It seems a little strange that you could get full firepower kind of off to the side, but it also seems strange that you can't fire at all in some circumstances. So I feel like I should be making a halfway decision here. If the unit cannot fire, I'll probably fudge around with this to what I like the best, which is If the unit has something directly in front of both it and the line extension, it has to fire, well, let's pick one with a line extension. If there's a unit here, it has to fire all its strength at that. But if there's like a unit here or here, it can choose to fire at one of them at reduced strength or something. I don't know. Just something to give me some capacity to defend myself when I'm like being hit from an oblique. I really don't feel like I should be completely incapable of firing at that. And I think that's what they were trying to avoid. But on the other hand, the maximum range fire also feels wrong. Like, it doesn't feel like Navy versus Wellington really addressed it. I feel like there should be a general rule. If you can see a unit with both your units, that's the unit you must fire at if you're going to fire. If you can't, you can at least fire at something, you know, partially. I don't know. All right. I'm going to work my way through the rest. Sure. Skirmishers. So, again, detachment of skirmishers is significantly different from Ney versus Wellington. You're going to be able to be a lot freer here. During facing formation phase, a skirmish company can be reincorporated. That's one aspect. Skirmishers are designated by nationality but not belonging to specific infantry units. Again, I can't tell the difference between Hanoverian and Brits, so they're going to all be like, I'm going to be able to detach Hanoverian skirmishers and reattach them to British units because I just can't tell the color difference. Okay. Class 1 infantry battalion can detach any part of or all of its troop strength into skirmish companies. A Class 1 battalion which detaches all of its troop strength into skirmish companies is removed from the map, and an equivalent number of skirmishers are placed in the hex of the battalion occupied. At the beginning of the game, the Allies have a few units that are completely turned into skirmishers. I'm assuming that's not the case if you go with the earlier start, but whatever. And it can never be reformed. A Class 1 infantry battalion may reincorporate any skirmisher company from the same nationality during facing formation. The reincorporated skirmisher is removed from the map, and the current troop strength of the battalion is raised accordingly. This will also raise its morale, which is one thing that I have a real grump about, is that these units, first of all, most units were not designed to be broken down entirely. That's someplace where Ney versus Wellington gets it better. They have the lights can be completely turned into skirmishers. Other units can't. Here it's just, if it's high quality, you can break it into skirmishers. The other is, the units were designed to operate with skirmishers in front of them. So the idea that like they're losing morale, essentially, effectiveness value, by losing skirmishers, by detaching their skirmishers, is kind of ludicrous. And this is a problem that happened with the Napoleonic Brigade series as well. They fixed it there. This game didn't get a chance, you know. It didn't get the same kind of consideration. There's not an easy way to fix it either, except by just giving people their skirmishers and not worrying about the strength of the units, which is what NBS basically turns into. Okay. You can't increase your troop strength above the minimum, above the original. A Class 2 infantry battalion can detach a maximum of 1 skirmish company. It must have its original printed troop strength, and it may never detach a skirmisher if its current troop strength is less than its original. A Class 2 battalion can reincorporate a maximum of 1 skirmisher company, provided that its current troop strength is at least 1 point less than its original. I got no idea how to keep track of who has reincorporated a skirmisher. I don't know what to do about this. Just not let them, or let them do it freely. This is going to require to play it by the rules would require a lot of additional record keeping. I'm tempted to go more towards the more restrictive side. Oh no, they do define how you do it. When a skirmish company is reincorporated into a Class 2 battalion, the current troop strength is not changed. However, when a skirmisher is reincorporated, it's considered to be part of the battalion rather than a separate unit. So you stack it in, you stack the skirmisher in with the strength point marker under the unit. Wow, that's painful. Probably won't do it much, but if I absolutely need to, sure. We can reinforce units. The thing is, we're probably going to be reinforcing units that did not break down into skirmishers. We're just putting extra skirmishers in the line to increase their effectiveness. Class 3 battalions cannot do either. What is the class of a battalion? I believe it's the same as it was in Ney versus Wellington. It's going to be based on the original effectiveness of the unit. If it has an effectiveness of 1 or 2, it is a Class 3 shitty unit. If it was 3 or 4, it's a Class 2 average unit. If it's 5 or 6, it's a Class 1 unit. I'm really disturbed by the fact that, like, the firing unit class is sort of the half the inverse of the number or something like that. It's just weird. It's like, one thing's going up, one thing's going down. Yeah, I get it. They're first rate, whatever. But, yeah, it's not pleasing to me. Oh. Okay. I gotta swap batteries. Skirmishers only pay 1 movement point for each hex they move in. They have all around facing. They're able to combine their fire if they're in the same hex, which isn't that huge a thing, but if they're in column or skirmisher, they can get onto the second column if there's 6 or more of them in a hex. Kind of doesn't feel like you're using skirmishers anymore if you're stacking them more than, 1 or 2 per hex. I don't know what the decision was on, why that decision was made to allow, like, skirmisher fire at strength point values that are bigger than formed units. What you're basically saying is 6 skirmishers is about the same. I don't know. I just don't know. Anyway, they also have a defensive advantage in that they're a Class 3 target. So their firepower will be a little reduced, but you're still, like, putting out a density of units that is actually higher than the density of an actual line of units. Now remember, that line of units is multiple ranks. For the French, it's going to be 3 ranks deep. For the Brits, it's going to be just 2 ranks. You're putting out the same density that would require an extended line for the French units to get this bonus at all. It would require an extended line for anything. So you're saying a shoulder-to-shoulder formation of men, 2 to 3 ranks deep, is, I don't know. I just don't know. It doesn't feel like you'd have the same bonuses that skirmishers have defensively, etc. if you're packing that many people into a hex. So it feels weird to me. And I have no problem with that. You could pack that many in there. I just don't really like that they get an advantage on the fire chart, that they get to move up to that second chart. I feel like that's going to create unrealistic firepower for the skirmishers, or unrealistic usage. Not so much the firepower. I don't mind if their firepower is higher. Anyway, let's keep talking about what else is up with them. In this game, unlike Ney versus Wellington, they can never move more than 5 hexes from an infantry battalion of the same nationality. They don't have to stay with the same one that they left. They just have to stay near their nationality. And this means, some units are set up that are more than 5 hexes from their nationality. This is the actual setup. This is kind of problematic. Quite a few. So I don't know how much he means these rules, because the official setup does not follow them. He's got these Dutch units here. There's no Dutch unit back here. These English units here, there's no English unit within 5 hexes. I don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Let's see if there's any exceptions. A skirmish company is not required to remain within 5 hexes of a battalion of the same nationality at all times. It's simply prohibited from moving further. It's almost like, yeah, you're set up in some good terrain. It's legal what's happening here, but you could have never positioned your stuff this way. That is disturbing to me. So I don't know. I feel like it's a correct rule. I mean, I guess you moved an infantry unit up in order to do this. I don't know. You could argue that never voluntarily move more than 5 hexes, that it means you can't leave that 5 hex range once you're there. So if I broke down units that were there, they could take their positions up. But I'm not so sure, because then it says it is simply prohibited from voluntarily moving further than 5 hexes from a battalion. I mean, do I have flexibility to move once I'm out there? That's the big question I have. I should. So I'm going to go with that interpretation, but it's just disturbing to me. Can never voluntarily enter the minimum range fire zone of a formed enemy infantry battalion. You may enter a hex at a cost of 1, and you're exempt from command control restrictions. Okay. Skirmishers aren't good at shocking. They can never execute a shock against a formed enemy unit. They can only execute shock against disordered, routed, and skirmish formations. They receive no benefit from being stacked with a command unit when involved in shock. They treat a DR or DR1 result as an R result. A skirmish company is neither disordered or routed by a shock combat result of D1, but they do lose a troop strength point. This is all the same. A skirmisher is automatically considered disordered. Yeah, it is a disordered unit. It's kind of funny. I learned to call them stragglers from the original NBS rules, because that's essentially what they were. Stragglers that you could get some combat capability out of. And they're very similar here. Routed skirmishers automatically rally if not in the fire zone of an enemy unit. They don't have to be with a friendly command unit. The restrictions on rallying look like they're stricter in this one. When a skirmisher's morale is checked, if the modified die roll exceeds the skirmisher's effective rating, the skirmish company routes. Yeah, no shock there. The die roll used to check a skirmish company's morale is raised by 1 if the skirmisher is out of ammunition. I get the feeling that I'm meant to defend the Hougoumont with the skirmishers. I'm not supposed to be putting formed units up there to fight. I'm not positive that's going to work, though. I'm very terrified by that. But the fact that the ammo supply rules only apply to skirmishers, and that ammo supply was a big deal there, makes me a little iffy about it. Okay. Square. Square formation of an infantry battalion. It's got a little marker. During facing formation, a formed unit in column or line can become a square. If it's line or extended line, it changes first to column and then to square. This is important for various reasons because you'll collapse into a column if you're disordered, if you're routed. An extended line formation may form square in either hex it occupies. Disordered or routed battalions may not adopt square. Battalion may not adopt square in an obstructed terrain hex. Obstructed terrain in this is going to be woods and buildings. Do they call it that? They call it hard cover and soft cover. They're not distinguishing between actual forest type stuff and just brambles or whatever. It's just soft cover. You wanted to keep terrain types limited. What else? When any battalion adopts square formation, any other infantry in that same hex adopt square. Has all around facing, no movement allowance. It's automatically disordered when it executes a shock attack. A cav unit is disordered when it executes a shock against an infantry square. The effectiveness of the topmost infantry battalion in square is increased by 2 when defending against shock made by enemy cav. It'll normally be a class 1 target, which is an unpleasant thing to be. And only infantry can take square, although skirmishers can be reincorporated into battalions that are in square formation. All right, we're going to pause there for a bit. I got to check this battery. I don't know why that's not charging. Alrighty. I've spent like the past 5 minutes trying to fuck around with that battery charger. It's pretending to be okay right now, but I know it'll fuck me over. Stacking rolls in this game. Alright. Total number of strength points allowed in a hex. In general, it's going to be 18 for infantry or artillery and 12 for cav. But in obstructed terrain, the woods and buildings, it drops down to 9. I think there's an exception if there's a unit that's bigger. I don't know if there are any units that are bigger in this one. There are some oversized units in Ney versus Wellington. If you end up overstacked somehow, you become disordered. And if there are skirmishers, they end up routing. Your current combat strength is used. All troop and gun strength points stacked in the hex count against it. Command units don't count as anything informational, whatever. Things we're used to. Horse artillery is considered artillery, not cavalry. Different nationalities can stack together. If you rearrange the stacking order of units in a friendly minimum fire range zone, the firepower gets a shot at the unit that was on top, you know. And that's kind of the general thought with the minimum range fire responses. You're able to take a shot at what used to be there. The one exception to this is skirmishers. I believe skirmishers do not generate fire when they're created. And they essentially screen the unit. So, yeah, they could kind of, well, they're not going to be able to screen the unit in that hex. They're going to have to leave. Now, somewhere it has to tell me because you can only have the same type of units in each stack. Well, no, they have and or artillery in a hex. Stacking limited of type. This may be different from Ney versus Wellington. I'm not seeing a penalty against stacking units of different types. There's no setup where an artillery piece is sitting on top of another type, so I don't know. Weird. Okay. Okay, here we go. Infantry units in different formations can never be stacked in the same except for during friendly facing formation phase when you're changing a formation to move something, creating skirmishers, whatever. A cav may never be stacked in the same hex as infantry or artillery. Yeah, okay. Here we go. Artillery and artillery crews are considered in skirmish formation regardless of whether the artillery is limbered or unlimbered. I don't know how much that affects things. Infantry and skirmish may freely stack with artillery. Infantry troop strength points which are not in skirmish may never stack with artillery. Okay, yeah. You're only allowed, with the one exception that skirmishers can be with artillery. Command units may freely stack with any formation. All units stacked in the same hex automatically are in the same involuntary formation, disorder, or route. A line is disordered when stacked in the same hex as any unit except another battalion in line formation and or a command unit. Extended line is automatically disordered if stacked with any unit other than a command unit in either of the hexes it occupies. We've got a couple of exemptions there, probably having to do with the formation changes. Only the top unit is able to fire, and it's the one that receives fire, although casualties can drop through. Command units are ignored for this. Multiple skirmishers in a hex can fire. Units stacked together operate as a single unitary strength group for shock. You use the effectiveness of the top unit. I'm tired. Here it is again. Okay, this has to do with disorder. There was like a weird marker just floating in the middle of the Navy versus Wellington. I don't think it's in here. Somewhere or another where like there was a 6 counter for no good reason. Like, maybe they replaced something with it that would have been even more confusing. Okay. Terrain. So, like I said, we've got a levels ranging from 0 up to 4 in elevations. We've got soft and hard cover, protected hexes. The protected hex is really an indication that a cover hex protects a particular hex, okay? So, well, a cover hex side. So whichever direction the cover spills in, that's where it's going to give the cover to, which is kind of a weird idea. So like this is going to be a sunken road essentially, maybe with some other cover to it. And thus it protects anything coming through the cover on it. Right. There might be some situations, well, we found one, where the cover extends in both directions. Whatever that is, it is like a hedgerow or something like that. It provides cover in either direction, in either of those hexes. So it's kind of reciprocal. Yeah, we look at the building, the wall. It defines which side is protected by it. There's something a little weird about that, but yeah, it probably mostly works. Otherwise, you'd have to use rules like Monmouth has, where one side is sitting behind the cover and they hold the cover essentially, and another unit moving up to it doesn't hold the cover, and you really don't have a good way to demonstrate that. So this is probably fine for this situation. Obstructed terrain, hexes are the hard and soft cover. Hex sides are the hard and soft cover hex sides. Because I'll be using that sometimes. Elevation 0 encompasses all terrain below 110 meters above sea level. Elevation 1. We have to read this because it was a necessary part of the Ney versus Wellington. I don't know if it is here. Elevation 1 is between 110 and 120. Elevation 2 is 120, 130. Elevation 3, 130 to 133 meters. Well, that's weird. I was going to say they're normally 10-meter increments. For some reason, and it had better not be required to use the actual number because the actual numbers don't exist on here. Hence, the formula used in Ney versus Wellington would not work. Regardless of formation, all units must expend at least one movement point to enter a clear hex. Yeah. You have to spend 2 to enter obstructed. You spend an additional to cross obstructed terrain hex sides. You expend an additional to cross a contour if you're moving uphill. Wow, I seem to remember that existing, and I think I completely ignored it in Ney versus Wellington. We'll see if I do better here. Okay, if you enter a hex traversed by a primary or secondary road, you pay the cost dictated by the other terrain in the hex. However, you can do road movement 1 point per hex if the stacking limit assigned to any hex entered via road movement is reduced to 9 strength points for the duration of the march phase. Overstacking is prohibited, and a formed unit is automatically disordered at the instant it employs the road movement exemption. This is a little weird because you also have, where is it? The Grand Tactical Movement. Okay, so they've changed things. Grand Tactical Movement no longer requires you to move on the road. You just have to keep a distance. But road movement has these new specific rules. Intriguing. It's just interesting to see because I had thought that Ney versus Wellington was pretty much a translation of these rules, but it's pretty clear it's not. Like there was a desire to cut complexity out rather than anything else. But yeah, so if you move in road movement, you're in a road column, that means you're going to be disordered at the end of it, essentially. We already went through the stacking limitations that go with terrain. Formation. If you're in obstructed terrain or cross an obstructed terrain hex side during any phase, that is going to disorder you. Okay, observation rules. These are completely different. You determine the facing of the sighted unit. You determine the line of sight between the sighting unit and the unit it's trying to observe. Draw a line. You determine if the line of sight is blocked or clear. Once it's established, you determine if any hex traversed by this contains blocking terrain. There's 3 types of blocking terrain: elevated hexes, obstructed hexes, and occupied hex. Any hex which contains blocking terrain may, important distinction between this and Ney versus Wellington, interrupt the line of sight, allowing the unit to see into that hex but preventing observation beyond the hex. The presence of blocking terrain does not automatically interrupt the line of sight, though. Whether blocking terrain actually interrupts or blocks the line of sight depends on the elevation of the 2 units. To determine if LOS between the 2 units is blocked, you do the following. If the 2 units occupy hexes which are at the same level of elevation, either unit can observe the other unless it goes through a higher elevation than either of the 2 hexes, it goes through an obstructed hex or a hex occupied by troop strength points at the same level of observation as the 2 units, or if both of the units occupy hexes in a descending slope. And we'll get to that in a bit, but this is what's meant to handle the reverse slopes. If the two units occupy hexes on different levels of elevation, the line of sight is automatically blocked if traversing any hex on a higher elevation than both. If the LOS is not blocked by the higher terrain, use the following procedure to determine whether or not the two units observe each other. Determine which of the two units is at the higher level of elevation. The observation is always initiated in the hex occupied by the higher unit, even when the lower unit is the one attempting to observe the unit. This is an important distinction. If this is in Ney versus Wellington, it clears up a problem. If the higher unit can observe the lower can also observe the higher. Yeah, let me see if this is in there. I'm not sure. I hate line of sight rules. I hate them. Okay, where are we? Count the number of hexes from the higher unit to the last hex which is higher than the hex occupied by the lower unit. Consider any obstructed hex or hex occupied by one or more troop strength points to be one level of elevation higher than its actual level, unless it's the hex occupied by the lower observing unit. If the LOS traverses an obstructed or occupied hex which is considered higher than both the units, the LOS is blocked. So you're going to count the number of hexes from the higher unit to the last hex that's higher than the lower unit. This is really important because if we're counting coming down something like this, right? Let's say I got a unit, I don't know, here. "13 out of 14 hexes, okay, are higher. This is what looks like a downslope from a higher position down to a riverbed. I should be able to see unless there's some kind of cliff in the way, right? Next, determine the difference in elevation levels between the hex occupied by the higher unit and the hex occupied by the lower unit. Well, we got a lot of differences. 1, 2, 3 levels. Now multiply the hex count, 14, by the elevation difference. Okay, that comes out to 42. Subtract the total occupied above from the original hex count total. If this ends up negative or 0, the two can observe each other. So I would have 42 off of that 13. I can see them. The slope is gentle enough, I guess. What happens if we're looking here? 3 hexes. Maybe not over 42, but 3 hexes to there, or 3 hexes to this. I've got the lower unit here, out of 4 hexes. See, now, you don't take into account the lower unit of hexes? Wait, step 3 is the number of hexes from the first hex at the same level of elevation as the lower observing unit. Yeah. Okay, so this is 3 hexes, this is 0. Here's what we're looking at. This is my observing unit. This is my observed unit. Let's make sure we get this right. There's a 3 hex difference and a 0 hex difference because I'm in the first hex after. And now okay, I did the other one wrong. This is just so insane, like the amount of words and everything. And it's like, I'm trying to see something that looks obvious to me, right? Somebody's on you know, a slope going down. Where did I pick? I don't remember where my first one was. But somebody's on a slope going down, and I can't tell whether or not they can see each other. So this was the first one, and I thought I had this figured out, right? Let's put it like that. So, step one, I determine which one's higher. That's this one. I count the number of hexes from the higher unit to the last hex that is higher. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I have a 6 there. Let me get a 6 and put it there. That's step 2. I don't know if step 2 did a damn thing for me. Yeah, that's going to be the number that I subtract from. Next, determine the difference in, now count the number of hexes from the first hex at the same level to the lower observing unit, inclusive. I don't know if this is a 1 or 0 the way they word it. Do we have an example of all this shit? We do. So this is either a 1 or 0. Wait, now count the number of hexes from the first hex, which is the same level as the lower unit, inclusive. So I think it's a 1. To the hex occupied by that unit, inclusive. I think that's a 1. Let's get a 1 here. Step 3 got us a 1. Now the difference of elevation levels between the occupied and the lower. That's going to be 1, 2, 3. I need another die. I have a 3 for step 4. Now multiply the hex count in step 3. That's 1, by the elevation difference, so I've got a total of 3. Now I subtract that 3 from 6, and I get a positive. These two cannot see each other. Gentle downward slope. I cannot see him. That is an unbelievable result to me. Okay? If this was a 0, it would be horrible because it would mean no matter what, if it's the first hex, I won't see it. Right? Multiply the hex count in step 3 by the elevation difference, which is 3, and I subtract, oh good God, now what? Multiply the hex count occupied by the elevation difference and keep it in this step. So this is a 3. I subtract 3 from 6 and I get a positive number. The idea being that there's too much high terrain, I guess. What about this one? Let's take a look. Let's look at the numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to the first hex higher, or the last hex higher. The number of hexes, still 1. The difference in elevation level is 1, 2, 3, 4 now, okay? So I multiply the hex count by the elevation difference. The hex count was 1. This is a 4. I can't see him either. This system just doesn't work, is my view. It just doesn't work. And let me tell you why it doesn't work. It doesn't work because they're counting, like, they're making each elevation difference be like little cliffs. That's the only way it makes any sense. And they're not. These are slopes. If something was a close to impassable cliff, it would be a much, much worse cost than it is. And it would generate shadows that these just don't make sense. It does not make sense to me that I'm on top of this hill and I cannot sight this unit. And again, I just think that the line of sight rules for this game are incorrectly generated, and then they were incorrectly generated for Ney versus Wellington from these. What works better? We'll get to it in a moment, but what we're going to see a little later, the reverse slope rule, is going to be the hint towards what we're going to see as an obstruction system. We're going to use what's basically what CWB ends up using for this. All right, I need to swap batteries, but we'll get to the next observation. But yeah, I'm throwing out the line of sight rules for this game. They're bogus. They aren't bogus, right? I'm not understanding them. Like, I am not capable of doing the calculations involved in them. Because I should be able to look and say, yeah, there's a potential problem there, or no, there's no problem there. And when I'm looking at a clear downslope, there's no way. There's no way that these work, in my mind. Okay. And I'm particularly disturbed because, I don't know. Anyway. When two units occupy at the same level, the LOS between these units is automatically considered blocked if both these units occupy hexes on a descending slope. What's a descending slope? Consider each unit to be facing the other along the line of sight. Now examine the position of each unit. If there's descending terrain, any hex which is lower level, closer to the rear than to the front of the unit is considered to occupy the descending slope. When making the determination if LOS passes directly along a hex side between descending terrain and terrain which is no lower, consider neither hex to contain descending terrain. If there's no descending terrain within 2 hexes of the unit's rear, the unit is not considered on a descending slope regardless of the result. So what this does is this lets me look at these, and this is why this is going to be the key to the whole thing. This lets me look at something like this and say, look, it's got 1 hex behind it is going down. So it's got 0 hexes that way. It's got 1 hex this way. It is behind the slope here. It's on the descending side of the slope. If something is more than 2 hexes away from the change, the slope is gentle enough that it's not going to affect things and you're on a plane. Here's where this is all going to kind of work, right? If I'm able to see, i.e. I'm no longer on the back end of the descending slope, then I just follow the slope line down and I can see whether or not that slope line is going to cause me an issue. Now, I may use something similar to that original if there's a potential blocking unit or obstructed hex that I could conceivably shoot over and see that as basically like a hill in the way or something along that line where, so if I'm having to fire, say from here, and I'm trying to do a sighting over these guys, yeah, then I have to worry. That thing can block. And there I'm going to use more of a TSS type calculation, which is going to have to do with how big a shadow this is going to produce. With considerations that, like, something that you can't see can't block your vision. Right? That was one problem in TSS. You could have a column of units in the shadow of blocking terrain, and you could say, okay, I can't see the first unit in the column because these woods are blocking me. But if that first unit in the column wasn't there, I could see the second unit in the column. But that first unit in the column is actually blocking the vision of the second unit in the column. And you could have the entire column completely invisible, stretching out into infinity. All right, so yes, we are going to ignore the line of sight rules in this, and just like in Ney versus Wellington, not all of them, but we're going to mostly ignore them, and just like in Ney versus Wellington, we're going to use a does it look that way? Because to me, it's bullshit that a gentle slope going down without these without like a ridge line or something in the way, right? That it is expressed on the map inexplicitly, right? Without something like a ridge line, there's just not going to be a problem. It's a gentle slope going down. That's all I see here. I do not see any cliffs or anything. And I really, I just can't buy this, whatever it was I drew. It was from like here down to here. He can't ignore the woods. He can't see the guy at the bottom of the hill, right? And honestly, I think at 1 hex, you might not be able to see it either. I don't know. But it's definitely we're not going to get any fire combat done at any range. Granted, ranges are not very big anyway. They're like 8 hexes. So maybe this somehow works magically. How many hexes was I here? This was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hexes. So this is within a range that would matter in the game. And I cannot see from the top of this hill or from this hex down to this hex. Could I see this hex? Maybe. We're increasing that multiplier, right, from 1 to 2. But basically anything at the base of a hill cannot be seen by anything that's up on the hill. And again, if you're on a cliff, yes. But this is across the board within this game. Is like if you're a little back from the edge of the slope, from where the slope is being expressed, you can't see down the hill. There's going to be a shadow, and I don't accept it. I just don't accept it. Of course, I can't see the original terrain that was at Waterloo, but I don't think it was filled with cliffs. All right. Terrain on fire combat, if you have a line of sight, you're fine. Hard and soft cover affect your target class. If you're shielded by a skirmish formation, you're automatically considered a soft cover target. This is different. Skirmishers do not block fire. You can fire through the skirmishers here. I don't think this was in the original, in the Ney versus Wellington. They say C11.34. Class 3 target is fired at a range of 5 or more hexes. Yeah, that's something special. Yeah, so this is it. If you're firing at class 3, which is the skirmishers and I think the artillery too, right? Yeah. Fire can go beyond that. Now this is only going to be artillery fire is able to do this, but whatever. Because the bodies of those skirmishers are indeed a soft cover. They're much like brambles or whatever. The strength of firepower of units occupying different hexes cannot be combined for fire combat. The strength for firepower of units stacked in a single hex may not be combined for firepower, except for skirmishers stacked. Shock combat. You're disordered when you shock into an obstructed hex or across an obstructed hex side. This disorder happens before defensive fire and before the shock attack is resolved. The shock may never be executed across an impassable hex side. You cannot combine troop strengths from different hexes for a shock combat. If they're in the same hex, they must be combined. The maximum number of strength points may not exceed stacking for that hex. If you've got more, you're in there with what you can. And no matter what, you'll be affected by the results, even if you're overstacked. Effectiveness rating of a unit can be modified to account for terrain on the shock combat, as noted on the shock combat results table. Here it gives you the protection values for the different terrain. A cav unit which cannot observe any enemy troops within the projected charge zone may not charge. They can't even create the charge zone. Cav charge zone extends into never extends into an obstructed hex. It does extend across obstructed hex sides. I don't know what this means. And I've had this problem with the Navy versus Wellington as well. I don't know if that creates a shadow. I don't think so. Cav unit may never enter an obstructed hex during the shock phase. It is automatically disordered if it crosses an obstructed hex side. So the question there becomes, look, if I'm in an obstructed hex, the cav isn't able to charge me, I don't have to roll my morale check. But if I'm behind an obstructed hex, am I somehow protected? And that becomes a lot fuzzier as to how to deal with that, because the cav charge zone, if it extends behind, is going to cause me to make a morale check and cause my movement to be different. The cav unit can theoretically hit me behind that obstructed hex, because it can curve around it. That generally involves disordering the cav, though, so it seems like less of a threat. But the same thing applies to units behind forces that are in the charge zone. And we're going to stop at fire combat as I take another break. You know, it's weird because I've done these almost the same rule set just recently, and it feels very painful to go through it, but I feel like I have to do it, man. So I think fire combat mainly stays the same between the two games. You're going to have like I said, you work your way in the reciprocal fire phase from one side of the board or of your lines to the other, unit by unit, alternating with the opposing player who does the same. He gets to pick which side he wants. This can create some gamey situations. Discussion on that in Navy versus Wellington. Although I may, while playing, grump about it again. There's something weird and gamey about it. And this game at least gives you counters for that. I was using these little markers. I don't know which I'm going to favor. These are probably easier to reach for, but again, I'm not certain. To mark the location that I'm firing from or planning to fire from next. For ranges, artillery goes out to 8 hexes, but it has 3 different categories of range, 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 8. Infantry has a minimum and maximum range, 1 to 2 hexes. You fire 1 unit at a time, and the artillery is done separately. You know, all the artillery is done before any of the infantry is done, which gives the artillery a powerful defensive advantage, even offensive advantage, because you can kind of park guns within minimum range zone for the gun, and it's not within minimum range zone for the infantry, and just, you know, light up infantry with that. Maybe a reason for skirmishers there. Okay, what you're going to do is you look up the type of formation that you have. Now, square, disordered, and maximum range infantry all fire on this crappiest thing, which is always going to be this first mega column, let's call it, because it still gets differentiated 3 times by firing unit class. Columns or skirmishers at minimum range, and maximum range artillery fire on the next line, and that creates another, you know, now that has 2 columns of differentiation. 3-rank line and medium range artillery. 3-rank line is everything except those special British Hanoverian, and I think King's German Legion, which are going to operate in the 2-rank line. I'll have to look that up. We'll see where that is. And the 2-rank line, or minimum range artillery, has the best modifier for strength to firepower. Now, remember that 2-rank line, if it's strength 4 or higher, it's an extended line, so it's got the problems that an extended line has. So actually, in terms of frontage, you're getting the same firepower out of both units. Within that, you cross-reference that mega column with one of these target classes. And column, square, enfilade, or mass target. Mass target, I think, is 9 or more, or more than 9 strength points. Line and cavalry will be next. Skirmishers, routed, and artillery. That's artillery being fired at in general. Soft cover or screen. Oh, whoa! They took it away. Okay, Ney versus Wellington had a difference between, and maybe something's different here. Artillery fired at for counter battery fire moves down to a class 4 in Ney versus Wellington. It doesn't appear to be here. I'll have to look and see if that's here. But basically, soft cover or screen. Screen just means you have human soft cover in front of you in terms of skirmishers, and then hard cover. Now, the class of the firing unit depends. For artillery, the class of the firing unit is the middle number here. For infantry, though, it is based on the original effectiveness value of the infantry unit. And that, if the original class is 1 or 2, you go to 3. If it's 3 or 4, 2, 5 or 6, you go to class 1. They're inverted and whatever. But yeah, and you're going to notice that the better firing class is a really big advantage, but so is strength point, and you kind of have to zone out on the thing to see. But honestly, I think strength point is more important. I don't know. Let's see. Let's take a look at this. This hits on a 2 here. Yeah, I don't know. I actually think they're both pretty important. Anyway. And then you roll a die on the cross-reference of the target class with the mega column with the minor column and get a result. The result's going to be a number, which is the number of casualties. If those casualties are on artillery, you've killed off the gun crew. Boom, it's gone. If those casualties are on infantry, they're going to be strength points taken off the infantry unit, which of course reduces its effectiveness, etc. It has impacts on the morale, all kind of stuff. Oh, now what was the thing I was looking at? I wanted to look at whether we got something here. Special targets. I think we're going to have to look a little bit more carefully in some cases. But restrictions on fire combat. Okay. Artillery batteries are eligible to fire during the reciprocal artillery, only infantry during the other. Yeah. Okay. You cannot fire command units, cavalry, routing formations, units that have no ammunition, limbered artillery, and artillery crews. Although I think you can convert the crews into skirmishers, at least in an optional role. The fire zone comes out the front. Yeah. Although shock combat is executed and resolved while opposing units occupy adjacent hexes, the attacking unit is considered to be attempting to enter the hex occupied by the defending units. This is going to cause an opportunity fire from the minimum range fire zone before they get to actually attack. And that is in part because of this sequence of play. If you had, a sequence of play more like TSS's, you've already got defensive fire before the shock combat happens. A unit cannot be fired on for being forced to adopt involuntary formation. If it's forced to retreat, yeah. We're getting some of the opportunity fire options here. Command units, when they take a hit, have a chance of being, well, if the stack they're in takes a hit, they have a chance on a 5 or 6 of being degraded, and they just flip over to their weaker side. And that'll cause a morale hit. You can try to shoot just a command unit if it's alone. It'll be considered a class 5 target. It's not clear, and it wasn't in Ney versus Wellington either, what happens. If you get a casualty, I think you still make a roll for that 5 or 6. Like, the casualty doesn't automatically hurt the unit, but maybe it gives you, class 5 targets, at best, you have a 1 in 6 chance to hit. So maybe that's sufficient. I don't know. I'm really not sure which way to do it. I don't see too much case of command units running around on their own, though. Okay, special targets. That's what we're looking at here. In general, a unit which cannot be observed cannot be fired upon. However, when a class 3 target is fired from a range of 5 or more hexes, that's by artillery, and the topmost unit directly behind the target unit may be attacked separately as a screen target class 4 under the following conditions. The firing unit and both the target units must be on the same level of elevation, and none of these units occupy a hex on a descending slope. As defined. The screen target must occupy a hex which is traversed by the LOS. Like, this is really, I think, how odd is it? Well, screening your units with skirmishers is a really good tactic. So I think this might be more likely than you might think. I don't know. But the range is what gets me. I'm not sure I want to fire my artillery out at range 5. If we take a look, max range artillery is firing at the same as the column or skirmish formation. It's a really low hit rate, and you have limited ammo in this game for artillery. Speaking of which, I think I'm going to have to pull that bag out again, right? The unit stacked directly under the battery unit must be either an artillery crew or a skirmish company of the same nationality as the battery unit. This is the crew. Wait, what? I don't know what this is. Oh, this is the artillery firing. Hold on. We're on special targets, not special firing. Yeah, so you do 2 separate attacks. Extended line is vulnerable to fire in both hexes that it occupies. A unit can observe either hex occupied by the extended line and can fire on it. It'll normally be a class 2 target unless it's enfilotted. Strength point losses are generally inflicted on the topmost unit, but they can plow through if you eliminate that. Normally, only the top combat unit can fire, except for skirmishers, pile up. There are 2 different types of line formations, 2 rank and 3 rank. Only British King's German and class 1 and 2 Hanoverian units form 2 rank formations. All other battalions form 3 rank formations whenever they adopt line or extended line. Here's my problem. I have to pay attention to what's Hanoverian and what's English. Now, I am guessing that there are no British, what was it, class 1 or was it class, fuck, I don't know. Class 1 and 2, okay. Class 1 and 2 means that we're looking at a morale level of 2. 1 or 2, an effectiveness level of 1 or 2. I don't think there are any English units that are that bad. So these guys are Hanoverian. These guys are Hanoverian. These are Landwehr, okay? They're marked as Landwehr. So they're very clearly Hanover units. And I'm not worried, like I can keep track of any red units with an effectiveness of 2 or less are not triple line, or not double line. They're triple line. That way I can kind of get around the problem that the 2 countermixes look exactly the same to me. I don't know why they did this. I really don't. Like, there could have been more of a distinction between the colors. Where were we? Yeah. Okay, so those form the 2 rank, and others form a 3 rank, and in the game an extended line is simply considered a line formation in 2 hexes. The British Army used, this is a historical note, used extended order to define skirmishers, attenuated skirmishers. An extended line formation can only fire as a line if its target can be observed by both. Again, I talked about this before. I'm tempted to fiddle with that a little bit, because it feels wrong that you couldn't get any fire at an oblique. But that involves me making up new rules and stuff. Artillery battery can only fire if it's the topmost unit in the hex it occupies. The battery must be unlimbered. The unit stacked directly under it has to be an artillery crew or skirmisher. The battery has to have a round of ammunition. If all those are satisfied, it may fire. Units stacked under an artillery battery may never fire. Now, I've got a problem with this game in that I don't have any ammo on the artillery yet. In Ney versus Wellington, when an artillery unit runs out of ammo, it gets removed from the game. That's not the case here. So I may have to go and put ammo markers under all of these artillery, just like you do in TSS. And therefore, with no ammo under it, instead of being full of ammo, it's empty, which makes sense, but, you know. If a skirmisher is acting as the crew for an artillery battery, it counts as a disordered formation. There were howitzers in the British battery, in each battery depicted in the game. Only one British horse battery, Bulls, was completely howitzers. Bulls can fire normally at any target it can observe. In addition, it can fire at a target that it cannot observe if the target is located in Bull's fire zone at a range of 5 to 8 hexes. It cannot be adjacent to an allied unit. Bull cannot have a skirmisher as his crew. And if all this is done, then it can fire as a disordered formation, firing over whatever it's firing at. Yeah, that seems pretty unlikely. That seems to be an unlikely to be desirable factor. Now, how much would you want to do this? Well, if it has the same limitation that you have to fire at the closest unit that Ney versus Wellington had, maybe you do not, maybe like the howitzer would be really, really hard to use anyway. I gotta check these batteries. They look like they're both charged, and this one looks like it's about dead. Interesting distinction in this one. You do have to fire at the closest unit, but there's an exception. If you're stacked with a command unit, you can choose to fire at something that is not the closest unit. But command range doesn't matter. You have to actually be stacked with the commander. Okay. Oh, yeah, here we go. One British horse battery, Wynyates, was equipped with to fire rockets. Due to the unreliability, the horizontal line titled Disordered Formations is used to resolve any fire combat done by this. In addition, it may not be fired by a skirmish company crew. Oh, good God. You know, this is obvious chrome. I wish they just left this fucker out. or gave it a different symbol or something. I don't know where I'm going to find this guy. There he is. A lot of firepower. What do the numbers on them mean? I don't know what that first number means on an artillery piece. Let's look it up. That's gun strength. No, that's crew combat strength. It will always be a 1. Okay. Gotcha. So, yeah, that... I wish it looked like a rocket instead of looking like artillery. Because this is not an optional rule or anything. This is part of the core rules. Bulls, I don't care, right? That's an option that I can take if I remember that he's got howitzers. I forget it, I'm not breaking the rules. I forget this, and every time this thing fires, it's going to be too effective. All right, here we've got some stuff about range. If an artillery formation is fired from a range of 5 or more hexes, the fire result represents guns eliminated by counter battery fire from the target. We do not have a different target class for counter battery fire. I'm okay with that, although I think Ney versus Wellington was making an attempt to improve the fire table. Ammunition. 2 things have to worry about ammunition: artillery and infantry skirmishers. Is there a different kind of skirmisher? When an infantry skirmish formation fires and it gets a roll of 6, the unit gets an out of ammo marker. And oddly, from my point of view, there's ammo depletion markers for every nationality. That feels weird to me. I mean, okay, but... weird and kind of annoying, because it means that we might have wrong colored markers on top of units and stuff like that. Same thing's true about disorder too. They're colored markers instead of white. I don't think that's a wise choice, to be honest, but anyway. When out of ammunition, a unit may move and participate in shock combat but may not fire. Any skirmisher which enters or leaves a hex containing an ammo marker automatically is out of ammo as well. At the beginning of a friendly command phase, the ammo marker is removed from any hex if it's possible to trace a supply line no longer than 5 hexes in length from the hex containing the marker to a hex occupied by an infantry battalion of the same nationality. This supply line may not be traced across an impassable hex side or into a hex within minimum range enemy fire zone unless occupied by a friendly combat unit. If no such line exists, the skirmisher remains out of ammunition and the ammo marker is left. When an ammo marker is removed, all skirmish formations in the hex are fully resupplied. Each artillery battery expends a round of ammunition each time it fires, regardless of range or class. Artillery ammunition is represented by a combat strength marker, which is stacked directly under the counter representing the current gun strength of a battery. Totally different mechanism than the other. I'm going to, again, use parenthesized units for this. Just other markers that don't come with the game. Artillery ammunition cannot be captured or used or destroyed by enemy units. In order to avoid confusion, the player may stack the ammunition marker directly under the battery crew unit. Unless stated otherwise in the scenario, each artillery battery's ammunition supply is limited to the class of the battery. Class 1 batteries have 8 rounds. Class 2 and 3 have 6. Okay, they say a combat strength marker is only used to represent the ammunition of a battery which has expended at least a round. This is weird because I don't think it says you remove artillery when it's out of ammo. So it kind of doesn't work. Unlike skirmish formations, there's no provision for resupplying artillery with ammunition. When an artillery battery has exhausted all of its supply of ammunition, an ammo depleted marker, okay, should be substituted for a strength marker used to indicate the battery's ammunition. We can do that. Friendly artillery batteries stacked in the same hex can transfer ammunition from one battery to the other if the hex is occupied by at least one artillery crew, the batteries are of the same class, type, and nationality. Type? Guess, I mean, you wouldn't want to load rocket ammo into anything else. But also, I think horse artillery versus normal? I don't know. No battery can move carrying more than its initial ammunition supply. Looks like you can actually load them up with too much, they just can't move. Skirmisher artillery crew formation forced to check morale while out of ammunition has a penalty. All right. Oh. I'm going to pause on shock combat. Again, this is stuff that I'm used to, but I just don't feel like plowing through it all. You know? Okay. The shock combat. So, if you've got units adjacent to each other when you hit the shock combat phase, your shock combat phase, you can declare those. And what you do, in general, is you make a comparison to get a ratio going up here. You're going to make a differential between the effectiveness ratings, and I believe that's current effectiveness, not base effectiveness, of the two forces. There are a significant number of modifiers to the effectiveness differential, or rating actually, which are thrown into place. And that'll get you a simple column that you roll on. And the results are, you know, various forms of disorder, routes, whatever, as well as the possibility of some casualties working in there. Make sure. Yeah, it's current effectiveness. You're not required to attack. When you do make the shock attack, before you make it, you're entering the enemy's hex, or you're trying to, which means they get a reaction fire. I already said something about that, but it's important. Command units, artillery and battery, artillery crew units, and routing formations cannot shock combat. You can only shock against an adjacent enemy occupied hex you face. You may execute more than one shock attack during the same shock combat phase. If you're attacked more than once during a shock, you may be attacked more than once during a shock combat phase. You may never, however, execute a shock attack after receiving a retreat or rout result for the remainder of the shock combat phase. This, I think, is different. I think you were only allowed one shock attack with an infantry formation in Ney versus Wellington. Cavalry could shock through several things. Infantry, I don't think you could, but I may be mistaken there. A given shock attack can involve units in two hexes, one which is occupied by one or more attacking units and one occupied by one or more defending units. Yeah. All right. Cav work a little differently. During command phase, you initiate a charge by Cav. The unit has to be in command control. I think you have to be in command control to shock. Not positive. Nope, command control has no effect. Okay. Cav has to be in command control. The unit has to be formed, i.e. not disordered or routed. Must be able to observe a hex occupied by at least one enemy troop strength point, and this hex has to be within the observing Cav unit's charge zone. before you put the markers out. Okay. A cav unit which is controlled by the phasing player and meets all these may initiate a charge. First, you make an unmodified morale check. If you're not disordered or routed from it, you initiate the charge and you put these markers out. This is your charge zone. That charge zone is going to then cause enemy units within it to make morale checks. And then you continue your own command phase, including initiating additional cavalry charges. You can initiate as many as you can get away with. If you're stacked together, you have to charge together. Now, during the shock combat phase, you can execute infantry shock attacks and initiate previously initiated cav charges in whatever order you like. If you enter a minimum charge zone of a formed enemy cav unit, this can cause the phasing player to initiate a cav charge. They declare the intention aloud. I think they have to make a morale check. And you can only do one opportunity charge at a time during the shock combat phase. Therefore, for each hex of movement, you're only allowed one. We have a long example here. Cav unit may never execute a shock attack without first initiating a charge. Once a cav unit executes a charge, it's required to move a minimum of 2 hexes, was 3 in Ney versus Wellington, during the shock combat phase in which a charge is executed. Why this difference? I don't know. I honestly don't. A cav charge never requires the expenditure of movement points. When executing a charge, a cav unit is required to execute a shock attack whenever it faces an enemy unit which occupies an adjacent hex, which is not an obstructed hex. This includes after you've advanced after a shock combat. You have to continue the charge if you keep hitting units that you're facing. But you only have to attack one of those units, and you can only attack one at a time, so that makes sense. Cav units may only enter a hex outside its charge zone as a direct result of a shock attack executed by the cav unit from within. This led to a bunch of disagreements with someone in terms of Ney versus Wellington. Here they give an absolute example. You must continue your charges even if they go beyond your charge zone. And you must keep hitting units, and you must advance. You're not limited to the charge zone in this. It's absolutely clear in this. It feels like it was ambiguous in the original, at least to me. Or not in the original, in Ney versus Wellington. I see that as the original because that's the first one I saw. But, you know, maybe they changed the rules and left the same ambiguity in place with the intention to circle around and around and around within the charge zone. I don't know. Can never enter an obstructed hex or execute a shock attack against an enemy unit occupying one. Can never... the only way you can end up in an obstructed hex is through a retreat. You're automatically disordered if the cav either attempts to move across an obstructed hex side, or if you shock against an enemy artillery battery or an infantry square. These things, no matter what the facing, will end up disordering the cav. Or if you enter a hex occupied by one or more friendly troop or gun strength points. This will also disorder the troop strength points, la la la. The cav unit, if it's formed and it changes its facing while executing a charge, it'll be disordered. And in the last hex it enters in executing a charge, after any after any attacks and whatever, you end up having to disorder. And what that means is basically at the end of your charge, you will be disordered no matter what. You do get a bonus if you're undisordered. When you execute your charge, you get a 1 point quality differential bonus in your favor. Now, when you generate your charge zone, you cause some issues for the opponent. And we probably want to switch batteries before we get into that. Okay. First of all, the movement point cost for any movement, facing, or formation change is doubled if you're within 6 hexes of an enemy cav unit within its charge range, blah, blah, blah. Wait, no. Within 6 hexes of an enemy cavalry unit, regardless of whether or not the phasing unit is within the charge zone. Interesting, I didn't realize that. That is, I think, different, but I'm not sure. I certainly played it differently. Wonder if I'll remember it. This is because the cav unit is moving faster. Yes, it is, but I don't know, man. I don't know if you should... I don't know. The psychological strain during facing formation, the topmost unit in each hex located within a charge zone. By the way, that facing formation comes immediately after, or I don't know if it's immediately, after the rally phase. So the French would declare their charges in the command phase, then there's a French rally phase, then the Allied facing formation, they'd have to make their checks. Yeah, I don't think it has any impact on the French rally, so you could make it as soon as the charges are declared, I think. I think that would work okay. Because I don't really do a facing formation phase, and I'd rather streamline things as much as possible. Basically, you have to make a morale check, which is raised by 2 if you're in minimum charge zone, and 1 if you're in medium range charge zone. And routing formation and infantry and square do not have to check formation, do not have to check morale. In shock combat, you get a number of different results. D1 is disordered, and you lose a troop strength point. DR is disordered and has to retreat 3 hexes without a strength point loss. Adjacent friendly units have to check morale for a unit breaking within its range. A DR1 is disordered, loses a troop strength, and has to retreat 3 hexes. Adjacent units have to check the morale, have to make a morale check. An attacking or defending unit which gets an R is routed. It loses 2 strength points and has to retreat 3 hexes. Adjacent friendly units have to make a morale check. If a disordered unit receives a DR or DR1, this results in it becoming an R result instead, with all the effects that happen to that. If a routed unit takes a loss or gets attacked, combat is resolved through the regular procedure to determine the result received by the attacking units. The defending unit takes another route with double losses, so 4 troop strength points and a 3 hex retreat. You can shock at less than 50%. You use the 50% ratio for that. You can shock at greater than +6. You use the +6 results for that. If you execute a shock at a differential of less than -2, the attacking units just take a DR result and the defending units are unaffected. If you shock at a differential at -2 or better and a ratio of 400% or greater, the defending units take a rout result and the attacking units are unaffected. I think this is different. I think the attacking units had to make a roll on that. And my battery's not charging, so I'll be back. Command units, if any troop strength points are lost, make a roll again, 5 or 6, they get reduced. They can't be reduced again for being hit. A discussion of retreats here. A routed formation which is not rallied during friendly rally phase has to retreat 6 hexes. Normally, otherwise, though, retreats will always be 3 hexes. When a unit's forced to retreat, all friendly units stacked in the same hex go with it. Retreat movement doesn't expend movement points. You aren't supposed to enter occupied friendly troop strength points if there's another permissible path. Friendly units stacked in a hex entered by a retreating unit are automatically disordered and forced to retreat. All retreats are executed by the player who controls the retreating units. They must retreat along the straightest permissible path. Retreating units may swerve around friendly and or enemy occupied hexes and impassable, but may not turn to avoid retreating off the map. This is a little bit more specific and I think valuable than the Ney versus Wellington statement. In determining the path of retreat, French units must retreat southward whenever possible. Non-Prussian must retreat north whenever possible. Prussians east. A unit may be fired on when it is forced to retreat out of a hex within an enemy unit's minimum range fire zone, but not the first hex, I think. That may be a correction in Ney versus Wellington. I don't know. Morale. So there's multiple types of morale in the game, basically two big ones. Units have a morale which is based on their effectiveness rating, which decreases as they take more and more casualties. But the army also has a general morale, which is impacted by casualties, but also by other things, and a lot more in this than in Ney versus Wellington. Okay, morale checks. You roll a die and compare it to the current effectiveness rating of the unit. If the unit was already unformed, disordered, or skirmisher, it'll rout if the modified die roll exceeds the current effectiveness rating. If the unit is formed, it becomes disordered if the modified die roll exceeds the current effectiveness rating by 3 or less, but routed if it's 4 or more. Topmost unit is responsible for the morale check. I like this. You know, I was playing Summer Storm, where basically you check each unit in the hex. Each unit in the hex makes its own morale checks, and then for rallying they make morale checks and all kind of crap. And it's just so cumbersome. I'm always opposed to overly cumbersome systems. Okay, you have to make morale checks whenever you lose troop strength points, whenever a friendly unit executing a disordered or routed retreat first occupies an adjacent hex, whenever a unit that's not in square formation occupies a hex within the charge zone, whenever one or more gun strength points are eliminated by a single enemy fire, the topmost unit stacked under the affected battery has to make a check. That's going to probably be the gun crew. Whenever all friendly troop strength points in an adjacent hex are eliminated or forced to retreat. I don't know if there's an exemption here. Command units, artillery battery, and routing formations never make checks on their own, but the gun crew does. Formed units doesn't have to make a morale check due to the presence of a routing skirmisher. A formed infantry battalion is not required to check morale when a friendly battalion with a higher class rating occupies an adjacent hex when executing a disordered or routed result. A disordered battalion is not excused. This is a little different. So, a unit holding the line next to you breaking, even if it's a shittier unit, does require that you make a morale check. under this system from what I can see, which is different from Ney versus Wellington. But one routing by you does not. And it's also by class, not by original effectiveness. Now, the two are very closely related, but what it means is there's less differentiation. You're just class 1, 2, or 3, as opposed to the 6 effectiveness ratings there are. When checking a unit's morale, the modified roll is compared to the current effectiveness rating of the checking unit, which means creating skirmishers reduces morale. Regardless of the circumstances, a mandatory morale check is always executed on the topmost unit. The effect of combat on all command units is resolved before you make a morale check. Units which rout must immediately retreat 3 hexes. Those that disorder are not required to retreat. Disorder and rout may only be removed during rally phase. The die roll used to check morale is modified according to the schedule. You'll notice, like, the minimum range charge zone modifier, that's applied for all checks as far as I can see, not simply the charge morale check when the charge is placed. You gain benefit of cover regardless of the position of the cover in relation to the causes of the morale check. Okay. During the rally phase, the phasing player removes disorder or rout from units he controls. You must remove disorder from each friendly occupied hex which is not obstructed terrain, because obstructed terrain disorders you automatically, and is not within minimum range fire zone of an enemy unit. Disorder markers may never be removed from obstructed terrain or hexes within the minimum range fire zone. You can change your facing to anything desired when you lose disorder. There's 2 exceptions to this. I don't know what they are. I have the feeling that, and I'm not going to like this, that it has to do with the extended line. And why do I not like this? It may have to do with guns. But if it has to do with extended line, okay, everything has to face in the same direction. Well, if you're disordered, they're all disordered. So that doesn't seem too applicable. 7.46. Okay, it does have to do with the gun facing. You don't get to reface your guns. If it had to do with extended line, I would be very worried because those collapse into themselves. And what's not spelled out in either game is the fact that, like, if you reorder as a line formation, if you were in line formation, you may sprout an extended line in a bad position, and you may not be able to rally because of that. And I don't know what to do in that case. Right? Immediately after you do all the disorder markers, you must then remove rout markers for each hex occupied by a friendly skirmish, which is not within maximum range fire zone of an enemy unit. Okay. Skirmishers go back to disordered. They say they recover good morale. They are disordered, so... Immediately after all eligible skirmishers are rallied, the phasing player must remove rout markers from all other friendly units that meet these 2 requirements. They cannot be within maximum range fire zone, and they're occupied by a command unit which bears the same nationality or the same brigade, division, or corps designation as the routing units. A depleted command unit can rally units within these restrictions. Occupied by, not within range. When a rout marker is removed from a unit which is not in skirmish formation, it's immediately replaced with a disorder marker. Thus, a routing unit takes 2 turns to recover. A rout marker may be removed from a unit which occupies obstructed terrain. After all eligible units are rallied, all remaining routed formations retreat 6 hexes. So, rallying is a lot harder in this, because they're using the command range for the command roles in this game. And this is somewhat, it creates a very, very different situation from Ney versus Wellington. And again, it feels like, yeah, why would you change so much? Either this game is good or that game is good. They can't both be good. When around, you know, I mean, right? Or maybe neither one's good and somewhere in the middle is what should be, right? But they can't both be right. That's the problem. When a route marker is removed from a unit which is not in skirmish, it's immediately, yeah, we talked about that. Disordered and routing formations remain in voluntary formations until rallied. Disordered units are able to move and can execute fire and shock. Routed cannot move, cannot execute fire or shock. Okay, let's talk about Army morale then. Army morale is an enumeration of the relative endurance which each army has. The scenario gives initial morale totals. So, for example, the French start at 350. The Anglo-Allied army starts at 325. The markers are used to reflect changes in the morale level from attrition of friendly troop strength points and command points and or capture of certain geographical objectives. When the brigade-sized formations are committed or deactivated, the phasing player records the effect of these activities on the record of command units. That's going to be this other chart, over here, which covers the number of brigades that you have active. Okay. During the first command phase of each hour, the phasing player adjusts the morale level of his army to reflect the effect of battle fatigue on the portion of his army which is presently committed. The records for both the French and Anglo-Allied armies are printed directly on the game map. There is no record for the Prussian army. During the scenarios which utilize Prussian units, Prussian track markers are used on the Allied route, on the Allied chart. Yeah. One morale point is subtracted for each friendly troop strength point which is eliminated or routed. I'm not going to keep track of routed losses until we get close to breaking an army. It doesn't make sense. Because one morale point is added for each routing friendly troop point which is rallied. Routed troop strength points which retreat off map may never be rallied. Disorder has no, so therefore you can count them as destroyed, essentially. Disorder has no effect on army morale. Sounds like it's raining. Doesn't look like it's raining. Wow. It's raining. Interesting. Oh, I knew this was going to happen, but one morale point is immediately subtracted from the appropriate army morale record for each friendly command point which is eliminated. So if a command unit is flipped over, you take the difference between the two sides, and that's going to be the amount of command points, the amount of morale points you lose. During the first command phase of each hour, the phasing player subtracts one morale point from his army morale record for each brigade-sized formation currently committed. Each hourly game turn has distinguished, they're yellow, on the game turn record track, so you can find these. All right. To remind you to adjust the army morale. It's over here under command where you activate and deactivate and how you do this. There's two geographical objectives which the army gets morale points for occupying. The Hougoumont, hex 2903, And Le Hasson, 45-28. Oh, I think that's this one. Okay. Where do we find this? The Hougomont's worth 15 morale points. Le Hasson is worth 10. Both of these objectives are occupied by the Anglo-Allied at the start of each scenario, and the point values are already included in their morale point total. During the game, when either is occupied by the French, the appropriate number of morale points are immediately subtracted from the Anglo-Allied and added to the French. If an Anglo-Allied unit recaptures it, the points are reversed. The instant an army's morale reaches 0, the army and all individual units associated with that army become demoralized. 2 markers are used to distinguish army demoralization. A demoralization marker is placed on the appropriate box of the morale record, and a disorder marker of the appropriate color is placed on the current game turn in the turn record track to distinguish how long the army has been demoralized, which is important because the army degrades every turn that it's demoralized. Well, every hour. The Hougoumont, La Hasson, and Plaisannot scenarios cease at the end of the first game turn in which either or both armies is demoralized. Whoever has the undemoralized army wins. We're not doing any of those, so don't worry. During the full-length historical battle and the optional early French assault, gameplay continues regardless of demoralization until the end of the 50th game turn, or until no committed opposing units remain on the map. When play continues beyond the first game turn in which one or more armies are demoralized, the effects of demoralization are imposed on for the remainder of the game. During each friendly command phase subsequent to the instant of demoralization, the current effectiveness rating of each infantry and cav unit in a demoralized army is reduced by 1. This reduction is not indicated by any marker. The players must mentally record the reduced effectiveness. You have a marker indicating how long ago demoralization happened, though. The reduced effectiveness of demoralized units whenever referencing the unit's effectiveness rating. This will have no effect on unit class for fire combat purpose, but it does affect shock and morale procedures. And the effectiveness rating of a unit can never go below 0. Following demoralization, as opposed to the differential, which can, following demoralization, the army morale record of a demoralized army accumulates morale points as a negative total in accordance with the normal restrictions. Morale points due to elimination of rout or friendly troop strength points are added to the morale record of a demoralized army. The morale points may never be subtracted from a demoralized army. Essentially what you've got is, once the demoralized marker's on the board, you're going into negative territory. And that's all that it is. It's an indicator that you're negative. During the first command phase of each hour, the phasing player adds 2 morale points to the morale record of a demoralized army for each brigade which remains committed. Routing formations of a demoralized army may never be rallied. When play ceases, the final morale totals of the Anglo-Allied and Prussian armies are combined, and if this combined total is compared to the final morale of the French army. If both totals are positive, the army with the greater total is the victor. If both totals are negative, the one with the smaller total is the victor. If both positive and negative totals exist, the army with the positive wins. And we have a differential here. Now, the important thing to note is that each command phase, each turn that you're on the board and you have a demoralized army, your effectiveness rating is being reduced by 1. Now, it doesn't say cumulative here, but the fact that you have to mark the turn when it's being demoralized, the way it's worded, I think that's the intention. So, your goal is to get the fuck out of Dodge once you have a demoralized army. Compare this to Ney versus Wellington, a game in which, supposedly the same system, we saw the Anglo-Allied army get demoralized, which is pretty much the French goal, and be in a position where, because the French probably couldn't afford to press their attack, they would be the Allied army, in order to have a chance of getting a draw in the game, would be forced, in demoralized state, to launch a massive counterattack against French units that are not trying to press their advantage anymore. If anything, they're trying to fall back because they don't care about the terrain advantages, right? If they're able to demoralize the Allied army and not be demoralized, they get a minimal victory condition. I was assessing the situation and saying the French were not going to try to press it further. They had no real chance of being able to achieve one of the more substantial victories. But the impact on the Allied army was basically, Wellington no longer cares about the strength of his force, about preserving his army for Waterloo. All he cares about doing is making sure that he demoralizes the French force, as well as his own, leading his demoralized force to to demoralize the French force as well. This is obviously just ludicrous, although I've seen people try to defend it. So, whatever. Some people are just, I would say, hidebound to like making any argument to try to justify, the rules to a game that they like otherwise. Yes, maybe demoralization means something entirely different in Ney versus Wellington. Maybe it means bloodlust for the Allied army. I don't know, but that was not the argument that was made. The argument that was made, I just don't buy. In fact, I don't care what argument you're going to make on this. I don't buy it. Basically, my view is Ney won the battle and put the victory in his pocket rather than trying to pursue and get a more intensive victory. Anyway, we're going to hit the command rules next, but I need to charge more batteries. And that includes my own. What about the command rules? These are new. I haven't phased these before. I've read them, but... okay, so we have command units deployed on the map. During the game, brigades are committed or deactivated by bringing the command units on the board, allowing the brigades to be in command. And you record how many units you have that have been activated so that you can take the morale penalties for that. Throughout the game, units may only voluntarily enter or leave the map in accordance with brigade commitment and deactivation, and may only move in accordance with the command control rules. The brigade commitment, deactivation, and command control rules are based on command designation rules. Each unit has a command designation. It's unit designation, right? Expressing the organization of each corps, division, brigade, and regiment within each army. Each unit is uniquely identified by its complete command designation. This is a little weird. You'll see there's a lot, like a couple of rows on each unit. Most more modern games have gotten to truncating parts of the designation, so that they only show the level above, or maybe 2 levels above. This shows a lot. So for French units, it identifies the unit's corps, division, and or brigade. The letter codes, yeah, we have different types of unit. That's actually not too important for the most part. Things like the Imperial Guard, of course, have special rules. And you have multiple ranks of commanders sequencing upward, which is important to keep in context. The Anglo-Allied, corps, division, brigade, regiment, and then battalion. Same, I guess. Again, specifics spelled out there. Distinct nationalities are going to be designated by color. You have to carefully coordinate the appropriate combat and command units. For example, there is both a British and Hanoverian brigade designated 322. The British brigade is commanded by Adam. The Hanoverian is commanded by Halkett. The divisional commander of both brigades is the British commander Clinton. That's great. It would be a lot more useful if the Hanoverians were somewhat more distinguishable from the British units. It's a real problem. The Prussian army is organized by corps, brigade, and regiment. Divisions are not employed. And we don't have to really worry too much about that. We didn't have to worry about a lot of the stuff. Command designations are not on artillery nor skirmishers. Battery, battalion, and regimental designations may be ignored. The rules governing command control and brigade commitment and deactivation utilize only Army Corps, division, and brigade designation. Command designations express the internal chain of command among units attached to a given corps. Each brigade command unit is considered subordinate to its divisional command, which is in turn subordinate to the corps command. Combat units are directly subordinated to the lowest command unit named in the combat unit's command designation, and indirectly subordinate to any other command unit named in the designation. All corps, division, and brigade command units are subordinate to the Army command from the same Army, and yeah. Command control. Strict control which commanders exerted over combat formations attached to their command. A combat unit must be in command control in order to move or change facing or formation. Command control does not affect ability to fire or shock, with an exception, cavalry, cav charges, yes. Command units, artillery crew, routing and disordered or skirmish formations are exempt from command control. A combat unit is in command control under either of the following circumstances. It occupies a hex which is within the command radius of the lowest command unit named on the command unit's command designation. For example, Bolton's British Foot Artillery Battery is in command control when it's within 4 hexes of the British 2nd Division command unit under Clinton, which possesses a command radius of 4. Sorry, Clinton, not under Clinton. The command unit occupies a hex which is also occupied by any command unit named in the combat unit's command designation and or any command unit of the same nationality as the combat unit, regardless of command designations. This is important because so any British commander can kind of command British troops, I guess, but you've got like you got the Prince of Orange here, who's in charge of the 1st Corps. Now, these are 2nd Corps. No, these are reserve. But the 1st Corps is up here, and it contains a lot of British units. Come over here, we're 1st Corps here as well. So, yeah, the Prince of Orange can take command of a British unit if it's part of his corps. As an example. Now, if you are not the proper commander, your range doesn't matter. You have to be stacked with the unit to move it around. A combat unit is not required to trace a path of hexes leading to the appropriate command unit in order to be considered in command control. The only requirement is that the combat unit be within the number of hexes denoted by the command radius of the command unit. A combat unit which is considered in command control at the beginning of a phase is considered in command control for the remainder. Cav unit has to be in command control in order to initiate a charge. I think I'm going to find these kind of painful to work with. The units are quite large. Like there's a lot of units, and there doesn't appear to be any attempt to create linear formations which can extend the command range. I think we're gonna find difficulty with that. Okay, but let's talk some more about brigade commitment and deactivation. Okay, brigade commitment and deactivation are the importance of Army maintenance against the withering effect of fatigue during a long battle like Waterloo. Also hot. During the game, a continuous tally of committed brigades within each army is maintained on the appropriate record of committed units. During the first command phase of each hour, the phasing player adjusts the morale of his army to reflect battle fatigue on the portion of the army which is presently committed. At the end of the first command phase of each hour, the phasing player may deactivate any brigade he controls which meets the necessary requirements. At the instant a brigade is committed, the brigade command unit may be deployed on top of any combat unit attached to that brigade. At the instant a brigade is deactivated, the brigade command unit must be removed. Now, I'll tell you what I'm not sure about right now is the intermediate commanders don't appear to be on the map for the most part. So for the French, they're going to have two commanders on the map, Napoleon and Ney. I don't know, and maybe we'll see the answer, but I don't remember seeing anything that says when the intermediates come in. I would think if anything under their command comes in, they should. I think that's what I have to go with if it doesn't say something explicit. An infantry or cav brigade can be committed in three ways. During the command phase, the phasing player can commit the brigade if any combat unit attached to the brigade occupies a hex within the command radius of any command unit named in the combat unit's designation, or any army command unit of the same nationality. For example, the French 1st Division can be brought in if Napoleon, Ney, those are the two army commanders, d'Erlon, who's the corps commander, and Alex, who's the 1st Division commander, has them within range. So radius does matter for something with these with the higher ranked commanders. A brigade is automatically committed at the instant any command unit attached to the brigade is required to check morale. A brigade is automatically committed at the instant any combat unit attached to the brigade enters the map in accordance with scenario reinforcements. The scenario rules may restrict which brigade may be committed during the course of a scenario. In addition, scenario rules may restrict which command unit may be deployed on the map at the start of the scenario and which markers may be deployed during the course of the scenario. These are absolute for the scenario, so within these restrictions during the command phase, the phasing player may deploy any command unit which was never previously deployed on the map on top of any combat unit which bears the same corps, division, or brigade designation if that combat unit occupies a hex within the command radius of any higher ranked command unit named in the combat unit's designation. The French army possesses two army command units, Napoleon and Ney, both of which are designated Army du Nord. The Prussian army possesses two command units, Blücher and Muffling. I don't know Muffling. Both of which are designated Army of the Rhine. It does not show up in any of the big strategic games that I have, as opposed to the rest of these. The Anglo-Allied army possesses one army command unit, Wellington, who also commands the reserve corps for the Anglo-Allied army. Skirmish companies may be detached from infantry battalions attached to committed brigades, may only be. Artillery crews are never committed, deactivated, or subject to command control restrictions. Didn't we have something about an artillery unit? Bolton's foot artillery is considered in command control? I guess not the gun crew. If they get loose, they can try to find their way to some place they can be. At the end of the first command phase of each hour, the phasing player may deactivate any infantry or cav brigade he controls which meets either of the following requirements. All the combat units attached to the brigade occupy hexes within the command radius of the brigade command unit, and no units attached to the brigade is within 8 hexes of an enemy unit. Give them a rest. All the combat units attached to the brigade, including the brigade command unit, exited the map from the same road hex, and no enemy unit has also exited the map from the same road hex. Skirmishers originally attached to or detached from a given brigade are ignored for brigade deactivation, i.e. they get to stay on the map and keep operating. No unit may exit the map until at least one army is demoralized. Once a single army is demoralized, any unit can exit the map within the restrictions. Unit may only exit the map from a road hex, which is adjacent to the edge of the map. Undemoralized units can exit from any road hex. Demoralized must exit according to appropriate retreat restrictions in 12.88. A unit must expend one movement point to exit the map and subject to all standard movement and command control restrictions until it physically exits the map. Skirmish artillery and routing are permanently removed from all further consideration after exiting the map. Other units which exit the map are stacked adjacent to the exit hex until they're deactivated or until an enemy unit exits the map from the same road hex, thus prohibiting the units which exited from that road hex from being deactivated for the remainder of the game. A unit may never re-enter the map subsequent to exiting. No movement or combat may occur between the units which exited on the same road hex. Victory is determined in accordance with 13.4, which is the morale differentials. It seems advisable to clarify the fact that opposing units which exit the map from the same road may never be deactivated, as this is intended to simulate a pursuit situation in which a player would utilize to prevent retreating units from gaining respite after exiting the map. The phasing player may only deactivate brigades at the end of the first command phase of each hour after the effects of battle fatigue on committed brigades have been subtracted. Brigades may never be deactivated before or after the first friendly command phase of each hour. The total on the appropriate record of committed units is reduced. I guess the commander is removed. I don't know. Okay. Some optional rules. One is hey, you can only take 15 minutes to do your march phase. Okay, whatever. Sequence of play optional rules. This is the one we're using where facing formation is done on a unit per unit basis just before it marches. Just as easier for me. Okay, the following Class 1, this is an optional, and I think I'll do this if I can remember it. Following Class 1 infantry battalions may never detach skirmishers. All battalions attached to either the 1st or 2nd divisions of the French Imperial Guard and British Highlander battalions, HI. All Class 1 or 2 British KGL and Hanoverian battalions of 6 or fewer troop strength points may adopt a 4-rank line formation, which is simply represented by placing a square on top of the unit in line formation, i.e. it doesn't use the extended line formation. For fire purposes, this formation is considered a 3-rank line formation and a Class 2 target. For shock combat, the unit is considered in square. Okay. During the friendly command phase, any formed Class 2 infantry battalion that possesses less than half its original troop strength may be removed from the map and replaced by an equal number of troop strength of skirmishers. I think this is a good idea. But is it historic? Like, it allows me to create something out of wrecked units. But is it accurate? Is it a viable, is it historically believable? I don't know. I haven't decided. The other two I was going to do. Line and column infantry may freely stack in the same hex. Note, however, that extended line may only stack with command. I think that's going to be an added complexity that I don't really need. During facing formation, an Anglo-Allied artillery crews may be incorporated into friendly infantry battalions according to the restrictions of 8.44. You can basically turn them into skirmishers in order to do that. For all purposes, all Hanoverian and Silesian Class 3 infantry battalions, Class 3 is shitty, Landwehr, are considered Class 2 units. Okay, let's see his notes on this. It was very difficult to ascertain the quality of these troops, which may have been higher than the class rating assigned in the standard rules. Thus, for play balance or historical study, reevaluate these units using French Class 2 infantry battalion as a model. I think he's making his best guess by making them Class 3, and let's just go with that. But it's certainly, this would be something that helps the Allies. Now, what's weird about it is, like, the way it's worded, historical and play balance, it sounds to me like he's saying it's more historically accurate and the play balance will be improved. I don't think that's what he actually means, so I'm just going to ignore it. Stacking and observation. A player may never examine any unit stacked under enemy troop strength points. Skirmishers may not be stacked in the same hex of different nationalities. I'm good with the skirmishers not being stacked. I don't think... I know I'm not going to really worry about the observation. Honestly, I'm often quite surprised at what I find defending. So, you know, whatever. It's essentially a play anyway. Fire combat optional. A unit which executes a shock attack may not subsequently fire in the same shock attack combat phase. That makes sense. Basically, if I shock attack and move into a position where I'm interdicting your retreat, I shouldn't get a shot at you. I'm busy during that time. I'm good with that, if I can remember it. Any non-disordered artillery battery may increase its maximum range 12 hexes. If it executes a firing range at a range of more than 8, it uses the disordered line on relative firepower. Yeah, okay, I don't care. I am probably not going to fire at that kind of range. When an artillery crew is eliminated by fire, it is simply inverted and becomes a skirmish company. I don't think I want to play with that. I don't see them becoming... I'm already iffy on them becoming regular troops, which I may not do. Shock combat optional. Skirmish can execute a maximum of 1 shock attack per shock combat phase. Yes, they should not be able to plow through what units they can hit. A cav unit may initiate a charge if it can observe a friendly command unit within its projected minimum range charge zone, and that command unit can observe an enemy troop strength point within the cav's maximum range charge zone. Yeah, I'm good with that. The commander can relay back information, sure, if I remember. All heavy cav units must move at least 6 hexes when executing a charge unless forced to retreat. Okay. They're less able to break off. I might be able to cope with that. There's not a lot of distinguishment between cav types. So you flip this over and it tells you it's a light cav. You're not going to see it in terms of quality, in terms of the number of troops or whatever. Again, I might not be consistent with this simply because I might not remember it, whatever. This is one of the problems with adding the optional rules, but I believe this one actually is purely intended to be real. Optional morale rules. All skirmish formations except French, British, King's German Legion, and Prussians add 1 to the die roll when checking morale. This is in addition to other circumstances which may raise or lower the die roll. I kind of like this. Except it doesn't include Hanoverians, which I can't tell the difference of. But yeah, I feel like the quality of skirmishers for certain nations was just better. And in particular, some of the allies were not going to do particularly well. During the Allied facing formation phase, any infantry formation which is neither British nor KGL, again, it's leaving the Hanoverians out, and I can't do that, but which occupies a hex adjacent to an infantry battalion attached to the 1st or 2nd Division of the French Imperial Guard, must check morale. I'm good with that. Again, I can't tell the Hanoverians, but this is, again, something that weakens the Allied army a little bit. The die roll used to resolve this morale check is increased by 2 after all other modifications are accounted for. Yeah. You don't want to be near the guard. They will scare you. Keep going. Optional command roles. All British and KGL artillery batteries are considered in command control any hex within Wellington's command radius. Sure, I don't care. The Brunswick command unit is deployed in depleted status. I've already done this due to the death of the Duke of Brunswick at the Battle of Cavalry. Napoleon's infamous lethargy is simulated by deploying his command unit in a depleted status. Sure. Why not? That allows him to activate things more slowly. It's not going to have much effect on play. Optional scenario rules. Is this 16.4? Yes. So Napoleon should be deployed in C-4621. A, B, C. This hex. Okay. It doesn't say Rossolme. That's back here. C-4621. Oh. Whatever. We'll take the hex number, not the location. How about that? Gnisnu actually delayed his army's arrival in support of Wellington by at least an hour. Thus, for play balance and historical, changed the arrival time of the Prussian and Second and Fourth Corps to game turn 20. Well, the Prussians don't come in until 24, so I don't know what the hell this is about. And the arrival of the Prussian first to game turn 30. Okay. And this increases Prussian morale. Sure. Each infantry... Okay, so now the rest is to deal with multiple player, where you could have a lot of players handling the various armies. So scenario-specific stuff. How about this? And we're almost done. So this is where this Kempt guy, I don't have a counter for him. I wanted to keep the number of brigades at 7. And I found one in the front that looks like it probably should have been there and put that one in instead. I don't know if the counter's changed, what's happening. I couldn't find any errata that mentioned this. No Prussian units are deployed on the map at the start of the scenario. We get the initial points. Okay, special rules for this. During the Allied command phase of game turn 24, the Anglo-Allied army is not demoralized. The Allied players required to act as follows. They start bringing Prussians into play. Prussian unit can never voluntarily enter a non-road hex east of the 3000 hex row on map B, which is more than 10 hexes from a French unit. Within this restriction, they can enter anywhere. There's all kind of rules for them. They're going to be coming in on map B over there, which is why the map is so big, is to give the Prussians room to deploy and the French some space to try to prevent them. If the Anglo-Allied army gets demoralized prior to game turn 24, no Prussians can enter the map and Prussian morale is completely ignored. If the Anglo-Allied army gets demoralized after the Prussians are on board, all Prussian brigade command units, which are beyond command radius of either of the Army of the Rhine units, must be removed from the map. All the brigades attached to these command units, as well as all Prussian brigades which are not deployed on the map, are automatically deactivated. Once a Prussian brigade is deactivated, it may only be committed when one of its attached combat units is forced to check morale or occupies a hex within the command radius of the Army of the Rhine. Prussian brigades which are deactivated before entering the map may never be committed for the remainder of the game. Prussian brigades cannot be voluntarily deactivated prior to the demoralization of either the French, Prussian, or Anglo-Allied army. If not already demoralized, the Anglo-Allied army is exempt from morale penalty on the first hourly Allied command phase following the first instance in which a French strength point is eliminated by a Prussian artillery fire. If already demoralized, the Anglo-Allied army is subject to the morale penalty. During any Allied command phase, the Prussian command unit muffling may be deployed on top of any Anglo-Allied combat unit within Wellington's command radius. Note that muffling has absolutely no command capacity over any unit attached to the Anglo-Allied army. Historically, the Baron served as the Prussian liaison officer. In all other respects, muffling is treated like any other command unit and possesses army-level command capacities over any unit in the Prussian army. So essentially, you don't get to bring him in with the Prussians, but he can run over from Wellington and join them at some point. Okay, fine. Infantry brigades attached to the French Imperial Guard may only be voluntarily committed by Napoleon. So he has to be the leader which orders them into play. At the instant an infantry battalion attached to either the 1st or 2nd Division of the French Imperial Guard is routed, all French units within 8 hexes of the hex in which the rout occurred have to check morale. This is checked in each hex occupied by a French unit, beginning with the hex closest to the one where the rout occurred and continuing outward. The die roll is used to resolve each morale check is raised by 3. You don't want to get your guards routed. Any unit routing will do it. Yeah, any guard unit routing. Victory conditions. It's accordance with 1347, the standard. The final Allied and French morale totals are increased by 3 points for each captured enemy artillery battery. At the end of the game, an artillery battery is captured if stacked in the same hex as an enemy troop strength point, or if no friendly troop strength points remain on the map. Okay? You can't use the enemy guns, but you can take them over. It feels like a complexity to me that, I don't know, I would rather have the guns be removed like in Ney versus Wellington, but all right. Of particular interest, though, what we're not going to do is the early assault game, which starts 10 turns earlier on the chart. One of the few times I'm not doing a more expansive view. The reason for this, the French start out with like 26 brigades committed, and they're going to have to march in and position themselves. And I'm trying to find the thing. I seem to remember something in this that caused this, that dealt with the soft ground. Getting all kind of limitations, explaining the entrance of the French. French may not be deactivated while off map until one army is demoralized. During the first 10 game turns only, here we go. No Anglo-Allied brigade may be voluntarily committed. The normal movement point costs imposed by terrain are doubled. This is the soft ground. The effects of 10.25 and 10.28 remain unaltered. I don't know what those are, but whatever. All artillery and cav remain disordered until the friendly rally phase of game turn 11. Napoleon didn't want to do this because his primary concern was that the artillery would not work properly, hitting the soft ground. But obviously Cav would also have difficulty in kind of mushy ground. So this all makes sense. And all restrictions of case 16.44 are in play. that is all these special rules here. Yeah. So it gives an option. There is a relatively detailed, there's some player notes that give you an idea, hey, you want to use your skirmishers to screen forces, stuff like that. You want to pay attention to the map, stuff that I'm probably going to fuck up because I'm no good at that, at tactics and whatnot. What I found incredibly useful was the depth of designer's notes that were put in play here, explaining a lot of why this system was designed the way it was. And I found that, very, very refreshing. And I think the SPI box games tended to do these. The designer's notes would show up sometimes in Moves magazine for S&T issues because they didn't want to print. They didn't want to take up the limited space in the magazine to put designer's notes, etc. And I only had a 1-year subscription to Moves, so like 6 issues, and I picked up a few random ones here and there for games that I, much after the fact on the used market for games that I really wanted, some information on, but mainly for modifications to games and whatnot. So for a lot of my games, I just don't have much interesting stuff in designer's notes, but I found these incredibly rich and much better than usual for SPI, which I feel is appropriate because the system is so different from what you would expect, especially that strange asymmetrical sequence of play. And what's interesting about it is that is so tied to this particular battle that at least that aspect of the system probably should have never been transferred to any other battles. Ney versus Wellington uses it. It's wrong there. But the problem is you can't use the same fire combat chart. You have to use a different fire combat chart if you're firing twice as often in a turn the way Monmouth does. And yeah, that starts to cause issues, especially if you're using only a 6-sided die and whatever, and there's already hits that are happening only on a 1 in 6 chance. It starts getting tricky, right? Okay, we're going to send this up after I swap some batteries, and I don't know when I'll start. Maybe today, maybe not.